The Handmaid of the Lord by Katherine Paterson. People think when your father is the minister that you get special favors, like you were God's pet or something. Rachel, for one, knew absolutely positively that it was not true. God didn't love her better than Jason McMillan, who was getting an entire set of Mighty Morphin Power Rangers for Christmas. God didn't love her better than that Carrie Wilson, who was getting a new Barbie dollhouse with 2 new dolls, outfits included. Not that Rachel really wanted a Barbie dollhouse, or Power Rangers, for that matter, but it was the principle of the thing. Carrie and Jason were getting what they asked Santa Claus for. When Rachel asked Santa for a horse, John and Beth just rolled their eyes. John and Beth were her older brother and sister. Beth was 11 and John 13, and they thought they knew everything. "But where would you keep a horse, Rachel?" her mother had asked. She was changing baby David's diapers and not paying Rachel much attention. "We live in the church manse. You know how small our yard is." "Rachel," her father had said in his most patient voice, "what is Christmas really about? If all you think about is Santa Claus, you're going to miss the main event." Rachel's heart sank. When your father told you to think what Christmas was really about, she knew what that meant. It meant no horse, not even a pony. Ministers' kids never got really good presents at Christmas. She should know that by now. It didn't count if you were naughty or nice. Gregory Austin had pulled the alarm last Sunday and made the fire trucks come in the middle of church service, but he was getting his own laptop computer. His daddy had said so. Her daddy told everybody they were supposed to be God's servants, like Jesus was. He didn't even mention presents. So, no good presents. Rachel had given up on that. But a big role in the primary class's Christmas play, that shouldn't be too much to ask for. She was by far the best actress in the 2nd grade. Plus, she went to Sunday school every single week, even when she had the sniffles, or it snowed so hard that she and John and Beth were the only kids there. "Don't you think a kid who comes every single Sunday, no matter if it's a blizzard, should get a good part in the Christmas play?" she asked. "We live next door to the church, stupid," John had said. "You don't get brownie points for walking across your side yard." "You're the minister's daughter, Rachel," Beth had said. It would look bad if you grabbed a big part." "Well, you got to be Angel Gabriel in both the 2nd and 3rd grade," Rachel reminded her. "Oh, but that was different," said Beth. "I was the only one in either class who could remember all the lines. The head angel has a lot to say. Besides, I speak out. Everyone in the back row heard me perfectly." "Oh, I can speak out," Rachel said, but no one paid any attention. When she was 5, she had been part of the heavenly host. It was a terrible part. The angel costumes were made of a stiff, gauzy stuff that itched something awful. Afterward, Mrs. McLaughlin, who ran the pageant, yelled at her right in front of everybody, "Rachel Thompson, angels are spiritual beings. They do not scratch themselves while they sing." You had the congregation laughing at the heavenly host. I was mortified. Last year, Mrs. McLaughlin had taken a rest from directing, and Ms. Westford had run the pageant. Ms. Westford believed in equal opportunity, so for the first time in the history of First Presbyterian Church, girls had been shepherds and wise men. That was okay with the girls, but the boys were mad. They didn't like the itchy angel costumes at all, and lots of the fathers complained. But Rachel had been a much better shepherd than those stupid boys. She didn't care what anyone had said afterward. She knew what the Bible meant when it said the shepherds were sore afraid. When Mr. Nelson shined the spotlight at them to show that the angel of the Lord was about to come upon them, Rachel had shown everyone in the church what it meant to be sore afraid. "Help! Help!" she cried loud enough to be heard by the people in the very last row. "Don't let it get me!" The congregation laughed. So did Gabriel and all the shepherds and the entire heavenly host. Mary laughed so hard she started choking, and Joseph had to whack her on the back. Her father said later that it had been a brand new insight on the Christmas story, and her mother said, "Never mind, dear. They weren't laughing at you." But Rachel knew better. No one in the whole church understood what the story was really about. When the Bible said sore afraid, you were supposed to be scared. When that big light hit her face, Rachel had been trembly all over. She knew in her heart that she was the only kid in the pageant who felt that way. Not even the second and third graders who got all the big parts did them right. If you couldn't have a scratching angel, you sure shouldn't have Joseph yawning so wide he could drive a tractor trailer straight down to his tonsils. It had been a hard year. Her mother had been tired and pregnant for most of it, and then when David finally was born, she'd gotten tired and busy. Beth thought David was the cutest thing in the world. "Was I cute when I was little?" Rachel asked her. "I can't remember," Beth said. I know you cried a lot, and your face got really red." And she went back to goo-gooing at the baby. John wasn't as silly, but he was always bragging about how great it was to have a little brother, finally. "What's the matter with little sisters?" Rachel asked. John just rolled his eyes. Now, at the end of the worst year of her entire life, Christmas wasn't going to be any better. Even the carols were against her. All those songs about the city of David. "Couldn't we make up a Christmas song about the city of Rachel?" she asked her mother. But her mother just smiled and kept on singing about David. "Hey," John said one night, "I just realized we're all in the Christmas story. David, Elizabeth, John." "What about me?" Rachel said. "Oh, you're in it," John said. "I am?" "Yeah." I can't remember the verse, but there's something off the side of the story about somebody named Rachel weeping and wailing. "It's because King Herod killed all her children," Beth said. Well, it just wasn't fair. Everyone else had a nice place in the story. Everyone but Rachel. It made her more determined than ever to have a good part in the play, one in which she would not scratch or yell or wail. Mary. She would be Mary. She was old enough this year. She was the best actress in the second grade. Surely, even if she was the minister's daughter, Mrs. McLaughlin would pick her. She'd be so good in class that Mrs. McLaughlin would just see that nobody deserved to be Mary more than Rachel did. Besides, her little brother had already been chosen to be baby Jesus. She ought to be Mary. Jesus shouldn't have a stranger be his mother. It might scare him. "Now," said Mrs. McLaughlin at the first practice, "it's a good thing we have a lot of kindergarten to third graders in this church because we have lots of parts in this play." "Mrs. McLaughlin?" Rachel said. "What is it, Rachel?" Mrs. McLaughlin's voice sounded a tiny bit impatient, so Rachel talked fast. "I know I'm the minister's kid and that when I was little sometimes—" "Yes, Rachel?" "Well, I've studied the part really hard, and since my brother is the baby Jesus, I thought, well, it would probably mean a lot to him if his big sister could be Mary." "But we don't have sixth graders in the play, Rachel. Elizabeth's too old." "Oh, I don't mean Elizabeth, Mrs. McLaughlin. I mean, what's the matter with me?" There was a burst of laughter in the room. Everyone was laughing at her. Rachel's face was scarlet. "Be quiet," she yelled. "I'm serious. I know the story better than anybody here, and it's my brother." Everyone laughed harder. Even the little ones, who were going to be itchy angels, were giggling. Oh, Rachel, dear, said Mrs. McLaughlin after she finally got control of the group. Of course you know the Christmas story. After all, your father is our minister. But Mary's a very difficult role. Oh, I can do it, Rachel muttered. But she knew it was no use. People weren't supposed to laugh at Mary. And everybody laughed at her when they paid her any attention at all. Carrie, Mrs. McLaughlin was saying, how would you like to be our Mary this year? Carrie Wilson? She had blue eyes and blonde curls all the way down her back and didn't look at all like a Mary. And that fake smile, it made Rachel sick to her stomach. Carrie Wilson's Mary would look like a plastic wimp. Mary was the handmaid of the Lord, for heaven's sakes, not some department store dummy. Rachel could hardly listen as Mrs. McLaughlin went down the list telling everyone what they were supposed to be. She knew now she wouldn't even get a speaking part. Mrs. McLaughlin didn't like her. Nobody liked her, not even God. Finally, Mrs. McLaughlin stopped. Rachel looked up. She hadn't heard her name. She didn't want to say anything because maybe her name had been called when she wasn't listening, and then Mrs. McLaughlin would have something else to fuss about. But she couldn't stand it. She raised her hand. Yes, Rachel? About my part? Yes, Rachel, this year you have a very important part. I do? Yes, you will be our understudy. Our what? Since you know the story so well, you will be prepared to substitute in case any of our actors become ill or unable to perform. Substitute? You mean I don't even have a part of my own? Oh, but you have all the parts. In case. Why, suppose, for example, Gabriel should lose her voice. You would step in and be our Gabriel. Jennifer Rouse, the third grader who had been chosen to be Gabriel, gave Rachel a dirty look. She had no intention of losing her voice. Or if, here Mrs. McLaughlin smiled sadly at Carrie Wilson, our Mary was to suddenly have to visit her grandmother in Ohio, you would have to step in and be our Mary. Oh, my grandmother's coming here for Christmas, Mrs. McLaughlin, Carrie said sweetly. Rachel wasn't stupid. She knew what Mrs. McLaughlin was doing. She wasn't keeping Rachel from having a big part. She was making sure that Rachel wouldn't have any part at all. She told her mother that she was never going back to Sunday school again in her whole entire life. Nonsense, dear, her mother said. And of course, she went back. Ministers' children have to go to Sunday school. It's the law or something. And then a miracle happened. 1 week before Christmas, Carrie Wilson, who wore the world's prissiest little blue leather boots, slipped on the ice in the mall parking lot and broke both her arms. Both of her arms. Rachel was overcome with exceeding great joy. God did love her. He did. One arm might count as an accident, but 2 arms were a miracle. God meant business. No matter how determined Mrs. McLaughlin was to keep her out of the play, God was going to make sure not only that she got in, but that she got the most important part in the whole shebang. She was going to be Mary, a handmaid of the Lord. Of course, she didn't tell anybody how joyful she was. She was too smart for that. When Mrs. McLaughlin called her on the phone, Rachel practically cried at the news that she would have to pinch hit for poor little Carrie. Oh, I'll do my best, Mrs. McLaughlin, she said quietly and humbly, just like the real Mary would have. She went early to the dress rehearsal so Mrs. McLaughlin could try the costume on her. It fit perfectly. Well, it would have fit practically anybody. Those robe things weren't exactly any size. But Rachel took it as a good sign when Mrs. McLaughlin sighed, admitted that yes, it did fit. Don't you worry, Mrs. McLaughlin, Rachel said. I'm the understudy. I know the part perfectly. Which was a little silly since Mary didn't say a word. just looked lovingly into the manger while everyone else sang and carried on. But she wanted Mrs. McLaughlin to know she wasn't going to do anything to make anybody laugh this year. She would be such a good Mary that Mrs. McLaughlin would be practically down on her knees begging her to take the part again next year. They'd probably have to extend the play past third grade so that they could keep Rachel in the role of Mary until she was grown up and through college and had babies of her own. "We have to eat early," Rachel told her mother on Christmas Eve. "Mrs. McLaughlin wants to cast there an hour before the service." "Thank goodness," said John. "I don't think I could stand another hour of loud Glorias sung off key." But Rachel didn't care. She was so happy. The Glorias just burst from her. Besides, she had to get them all out before 7 o'clock. She couldn't let a stray Gloria pass her lips when she was behind the manger. God might understand, but Mrs. McLaughlin sure wouldn't. She was all dressed in the sky blue robe, sitting quietly, looking down into the empty manger. Mrs. McLaughlin, hoarse from yelling at the heavenly hosts, was giving last-minute directions to the wise men when suddenly the back door of the sanctuary opened. "Why, Mrs. Wilson." "Carrie," Mrs. McLaughlin said. Rachel jerked up in alarm. It was Carrie, standing in the darkened sanctuary, her fake fur-trimmed coat hanging off her shoulders, both arms bound to the front of her body. "She insisted," Mrs. Wilson was saying. "She said, 'The show must go on.' I talked to Dr. Franklin, and he said it would be the best thing in the world for her. She was so distressed about letting everyone down that it was having a negative effect on the healing process." Two mothers yanked the beautiful blue robe off Rachel and draped it over Carrie's head. "See, it was meant to be," Mrs. Wilson said. "It totally hides the cast." Rachel slunk off the platform and slumped down in the first pew. No one noticed. All the adults were oohing and awing about how brave Carrie was to come and save the play. "Oh yes, she's in terrible pain," her mother was saying, "but she couldn't bear to disappoint you all." No one cared that Rachel was disappointed, not even God. Of course, God had known all along that Carrie would show up at the last minute and steal back the part. God knew everything, and he had let Rachel sing and rejoice and think for a few days that he was on her side, that he had chosen her, like Mary, to be his handmaid. But it was just a big joke, a big, mean joke. She kicked the red carpet at her feet. Off stage, everyone. Time to line up in your places." Where did you go when there wasn't any place for you? Rachel looked around. People were beginning to arrive for the service. She slipped farther down in the pew. She didn't want her family to see her. They'd find out soon enough that God had fired her. She saw her mother carry David up the far aisle. The baby was sucking happily on his pacifier. He would be a good Jesus. Everyone would say so. Mrs. McLaughlin was waiting at the door to the hall. She took David and said something to Mom, who cocked her head in a doubtful manner. Was she telling Mom that Rachel wasn't going to be Mary after all? If she did, maybe Mom would come over and take her on her lap and tell her that she was sorry. No, Mom didn't even look her way. Well, the play went well. None of the angels cried or scratched. Gabriel knew all her lines and said them loud enough to be heard almost to the back row. The wise men remembered to carry in their gifts, and nobody's crown rolled off. Joseph did not yawn, and Mary gazed sweetly into the manger. It was all perfect. Perfect without her. Rachel felt like weeping and wailing like Rachel in the Bible. And then, suddenly, a miracle occurred. Baby Jesus began to cry. Not just cry, but scream. Yell his little lungs out. Carrie Wilson forgot about being married. She turned absolutely white and her eyes went huge like she was about to panic. She would probably have got up and run, but her arms bound under her robe made it so that she couldn't move. She looked at Joseph. "Do something," she whispered. Joseph's face went bright red, but he didn't move a muscle. It was all up to Rachel. She jumped from her pew and dashed up the chancel steps. She was still panting when she got to the manger. Rachel poked around under the baby until she located the pacifier and jammed it into David's open mouth. He clamped down on it at once. The big church went silent, except for his noisy sucking. Rachel smiled down at him. He was a lovely Jesus. "Who do you think you are?" Carrie Wilson hissed through her teeth. But the whisper was almost loud enough to be heard in the back row. Rachel could hear a snicker from somewhere out in the darkened sanctuary. "Behold!" Rachel straightened up and stared sternly in the direction of the offender. There was no doubt that the people in the last row could hear her. "I am the handmaid of the Lord, and I say unto you, glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace and goodwill to men, women, and children." Nobody laughed. They didn't dare. The end.